Last night we had mentioned that we completed Surah Al-Mu'minun, the chapter of the believers, and it mentioned qualities of the believers. And then after Surah Al-Mu'minun was Surah An-Nur, which is the chapter of radiance and light, brilliance from Allah. And the believers are blessed with Nur because of their Iman. And oftentimes, Iman is associated with very spiritual things, but it is also associated with very technical things as well. It's not just inward stuff, but there are outward, technical, legal ramifications of what it means to have Nur. And that includes following the laws of Allah and allowing to allowing ourselves to submit to Allah's command. So in Surah An-Nur, it began with laws of promiscuity and chastity laws, things with corporal punishment that had to do with lashing, very, very serious things. It would further discuss in this surah laws of gender interactions, whose home you can openly and freely enter, and not have to worry about covering. So this idea somehow like of um, Islam not having any kind of gender etiquette, or gender etiquette being archaic or outdated, is something very, very um, uh, misunderstood. There are gender rules and gender etiquettes in Islam. We don't have to succumb to modern ideologies of feminism and what it means to empower a woman. Empowering women doesn't mean treating them like a man or allowing women to do what men do. Men and women are very different, and they were treated very differently in the Quran, and they were addressed very differently in the Quran. It has nothing to do with superiority or inferiority, but it has everything to do with just simply being different. And if you don't acknowledge differences in things or use things according to how they were created, then things become destroyed and damaged. And that's why there's a lot of damage in our societies when it comes to gender interactions, when it comes to mistreatment of women, and also mistreatment of men. It goes both ways nowadays, although no one's going to cry for men. No one wants to hear the sufferings that men have to go through, mashallah, and rightfully so. Um, but there are laws that deal. There are gender interaction rules and etiquettes mentioned in Surah An-Nur. Um, there are also family interactions, and subhanallah, like it speaks about three specific times that are considered aura, that are considered private, and children, right, youngsters should be familiar with these things, where you respect the privacy of the adults in your house, namely your parents. So after Fajr, after the Dhahira, after the Zenith, and after Isha, these are times when you start getting older. You should also respect the privacy of your parents, and you should knock before you go into their rooms. So, and these are the type of things which the Quran speaks about openly. Sometimes people get embarrassed and they're shy, like, how can you talk about this? SubhanAllah, did we not just talk about it in prayer? So, how, mashallah, like, how open can we be if we need to be? There are things that need to be discussed openly, and these are etiquettes that youngsters at some point have to understand too. So, when you get older, you should respect the privacy of even your parents and other elders in your house. So, those are times oftentimes when they're trying to get rest, they're trying to maybe get have some privacy so they can relax. So if you look at the time after Fajr, the time after the zenith, when it's really hot, typically this was a time of the day when people would close shop and relax, um, because it was not really functional to be outside at that time because of the heat. um, and people had to take advantage of the sunlight, so they'd actually be up from sunrise all the way till sundown, and then after Isha. So those are times of privacy. So these laws and these gender interactions, right, are discussed in Surah An-Nur. So they have to do with light. If a person really, really wants to have Nur from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has to do with upholding the command of Allah. It's not just trying to be spiritual. It's not just about, a lot of people nowadays, they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm spiritual, not religious. And so this is, mashallah, just a way of saying that I want to just, I want my own idea of practicing faith without having to be told what I need to do. And I can just feel good about it. Islam is not just about feeling good, but it's feeling good for the sake of Allah. At the same time, Nur is something very spiritual. It is something of the heart. We did mention that Nur is the light which allows you to see the difference between what's right and what's wrong, the light of Iman. So in this verse, in Surah An-Nur, it also talks about something I'm sure we've mentioned before, the idea of ignorance and not knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if a person is deprived of nur, of light from Allah, and ultimately what is light also is guidance. So you had the ayat nur is in Surah An-Nur. So Surah An-Nur is called, one of the reasons it gets its name is because the verse of light. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. And ما معنى هذا يعني هادي من فيهما, meaning that he's the guide in the heavens and the earth. He's the one who guides all those in the heavens and the earth. So it's through that light that people are guided. If a person doesn't have that light, then it's like they're in a darkness. So the analogy given is twofold. One is a darkness, or if they're deprived of that light. One is a very, what you call al-jahlul basit, a very simple ignorance of just not knowing. And the example given is a person who's under waves, covered by clouds. You're in the depths of the ocean. And this is also some miraculous thing. It sleeps me now. I took like oceanography as an undergrad, so that was over 20 years ago. And so I forget the levels of the water. Did anyone know the first level of water, the second current, before you get to the abyss? It's based on the amount of light which can penetrate into the ocean. So at some point, light cannot penetrate. So water itself is matter, and it prevents light from going deep. So there are areas of the ocean which are completely dark, and you call that the abyss. So there are different currents, however, of temperature of water and the amount of light which goes through the water. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this in Surah An-Nur. And he says that there's mawjun fawqaha sahab. There's waves upon waves. You don't just have waves on the surface. There are currents or waves upon currents or waves, and then you have the surface. So he gives the example of a person who's in darkness as a person who is under a current, above which are clouds. How dark will that be? Because you're already deprived of light as it is because of the depth of the ocean, and then you have the clouds blocking the light. So if a person were to even put his hand in front of him, he would not be able to see his hand. Right? So there's depths in the water where you can't even see the hand in front of you. That's how dark it is in there. This is an example that Allah Ta'ala gives of a person who has al-jahlul basit. It's a very simple form of ignorance, of simply not knowing. But perhaps if they knew, they might be guided. And many people are in this state. And the pre-Islamic Arabs were described as being in this state, which is why they were receptive to the message when they came. Because people who are in darkness, if you turn on the light, it's like, oh, wow, this is nice to be able to see. But then there are other people who actually do have light, but they're misguided, and it's like a mirage. So the second form of ignorance is al-jahlul murakkab, which is the compound ignorance, where people think they know, but they don't. This is the more stubborn type of ignorance, which is hard for people to be convinced about. Because if you don't, if a person doesn't have the humility to understand or think that I might be wrong, they're never gonna want to like hear anything. So the example is given like a person who is in the desert and he sees a mirage and he thinks that there's water there and he's approaching it until he gets there and he finds nothing there. And instead he finds Allah. Meaning what? When death comes. He thinks he's going towards what is right. And then when death comes, he has nothing. And he realizes everything that he thought was supposed to be worthy of praise and good is no longer there. And he'll find whatever he did with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it'll be a rude awakening for that person. So this is the person, when he sees the mirage, he thinks like, and you try to tell this person, don't go there, there's no good there. What are you talking about? I can see it very clearly. Who are you to tell me that I'm wrong? I can see with my own eyes. Not realizing that maybe their eyes are deceiving them. That's why our own senses we're not materialists. We don't just rely on what we sense, because we know that our eyes can deceive us, our ears can deceive us, and there's something beyond just the five senses. So this idea that if God exists, you have to show him to me, let me see him. This is irrational, and this is limiting what we're capable of knowing. So this is described in Surah An-Nur as well, and the commentators mentioned this is what you call al-jahl murakkab. It's a compound ignorance which is much more difficult to break.